By late 1942, William Crawford no longer doubted his conclusion. The left turn was the silent killer. What had once appeared as a collection of tragic coincidences had revealed itself as a pattern so precise it was almost mechanical. The same maneuver, the same altitude, the same fatal outcome. Again and again, Crawford returned to the training manuals, not to memorize them, but to understand what they assumed. The manuals spoke confidently of procedures, angles, airspeed, and instrument checks. They were written as if pilots could always see what they needed to see. But Crawford knew that assumption was false. In theory, pilots were trained to rely on their instruments. In practice, especially at low altitude, they relied on their eyes. Vision came first. Instruments confirmed what the pilot already believed to be true. And during tight left turns, vision betrayed them. Crawford reconstructed the maneuver in his mind. He imagined himself in the cockpit, hands on the controls, body pressed into the seat as the aircraft banked. The nose dipped slightly. The left wing rose into view. The canopy frame cut across the field of vision. Then the ground disappeared. In that instant, the pilot faced a cruel dilemma. Trust the instrument small, abstract, and requiring interpretation, or trust bodily sensation. Most chose sensation, and sensation was wrong. The human inner ear could not detect steady turns accurately. It produced illusions. Pilots felt level when they were not. They felt stable while descending into the ground. This was not weakness, it was biology. Crawford realized that training pilots harder would not fix biology. Discipline could not overcome human perception. The Air Force was fighting the wrong enemy. The true enemy was disorientation. Crash investigations continued to mislabel the cause as pilot error, but Crawford now understood the deeper truth. The pilots were doing exactly what humans naturally do when deprived of reliable visual information. They were trying to survive. Crawford began reviewing every accident report he could access. He paid attention to the smallest details: weather conditions, time of day, altitude, type of aircraft, clear skies, good visibility, no mechanical failure. The crashes made no sense until you accounted for what the pilot could see. He started talking again to instructors, more carefully this time. "What do you see in a tight left turn?" he asked. Most shrugged. "Same as any turn," they said. But when Crawford pressed gently, some admitted the truth. "You lose the ground for a moment. It feels strange, but you learn to compensate. Everyone goes through it." Everyone went through it. Not everyone survived. The phrase haunted him. He began timing the moments during training exercises. Seconds mattered. From the moment a pilot lost the horizon to the moment of impact, sometimes less than 10 seconds passed. There was no margin for confusion. Instructors assumed pilots would recognize disorientation and correct it. Crawford saw how unrealistic that expectation was. Recognizing disorientation required awareness that vanished the instant visual reference was lost. The left turn was not just a maneuver, it was a trap, a perfectly designed trap, built unintentionally into training itself. Crawford thought about the aircraft designers. They were not careless. They were brilliant engineers optimizing performance and visibility where it seemed most important, forward and upward. No one had prioritized visibility downward to the left. No one had imagined that such a small blind spot could kill thousands. And that realization led Crawford to something even more unsettling. If the solution was obvious once seen, then the problem was not lack of intelligence, it was lack of perspective. The experts were too close to their own assumptions. They trusted complexity, they trusted experience, they trusted the idea that if something had worked before, it would continue to work. Crawford, unburdened by authority or tradition, saw the problem differently. He was not asking how pilots should behave, he was asking what pilots actually did. That difference mattered, and now the solution was forming clearly in his mind. It was not a new instrument, it was not a redesign, it was not a lengthy training overhaul. It was something almost embarrassingly simple. A reference, a line. If the pilot could not see the horizon outside, then the horizon had to be placed where the pilot could not miss it. Inside the cockpit, the idea felt dangerous even to think about. Military aviation prized sophistication, suggesting a solution as crude as a painted line bordered on insult. Crawford hesitated, not because he doubted the idea, but because he understood the culture he was challenging. He knew what would happen. They would say it was too simple, too obvious, too unworthy of serious consideration. And worst of all, they would say, if it were that easy, someone else would have thought of it. But no one had, because no one had looked the way Crawford looked. Still, an idea without action was useless, and every day he waited, more pilots died. Crawford faced a choice: remain silent, safe within his rank, watching the numbers rise, or speak and risk humiliation, punishment, and being ignored. The left turn had already killed too many. Crawford decided it was time to cross the line.
By the time William Crawford reached this stage of his training, the pattern was no longer vague. It was unmistakable. The accidents were not random. They never had been. While senior officers debated theories and engineers adjusted diagrams, Crawford continued to do something far less impressive and far more effective. He watched, not casually, not from a distance, but with the quiet intensity of someone who understands that answers often hide in plain sight. Each day followed a similar rhythm. Engines roared to life before sunrise. Cadets lined up beside their aircraft, helmets tucked under their arms. Instructors shouted commands over the noise. From the outside, the training program appeared disciplined and precise. From the inside, Crawford saw something else. He saw hesitation. He saw confusion. He saw moments when pilots were flying not by knowledge, but by instinct. And instinct, he realized, was only as reliable as the information it received. Crawford began positioning himself near specific sections of the airfield, places where training maneuvers were repeated over and over. He focused on low-altitude turning exercises, watching aircraft as they banked left, then right, then descended. The difference was subtle, but it was there. Right turns were smooth, predictable. Pilots seemed relaxed, even confident. Left turns were different. During tight left banks, the aircraft's nose dipped slightly. The wings tilted in a way that obscured the pilot's view of the ground. From Crawford's position on the field, he could see what the pilot could not. The horizon vanished. Not gradually, but suddenly. For a brief moment, the pilot had nothing to anchor his sense of balance. No ground reference. No clear lines separating sky from earth. Just sky, instrument needles, and instinct. That moment was where things went wrong. Crawford noticed that pilots often compensated instinctively. When deprived of visual reference, they relied on inner sensation, the feeling of tilt, pressure, acceleration. But the human body is notoriously unreliable in flight. Sensations can lie. The inner ear can deceive. Crawford did not know the science behind spatial disorientation, but he was watching it happen, again and again. After accidents, he listened carefully to conversations among instructors. They spoke in clipped, professional tones, masking frustration behind discipline. He didn't trust his instruments. He overcorrected. He panicked. Crawford noticed something troubling. These explanations blamed the pilot without explaining why the pilot behaved that way. Why did experienced trainees suddenly make fatal mistakes during otherwise routine maneuvers? Why did the errors cluster around specific movements? Why left turns? He returned to his sketches. The cockpit drawings grew more detailed. He carefully marked the position of the pilot's head, the angle of the canopy frame, the location of the wing during a bank. Slowly, a geometric truth emerged. In a left turn, the pilot's line of sight toward the ground was blocked by the aircraft's own structure. It was not a flaw in skill. It was a flaw in visibility. Crawford tested his theory the only way he could, by asking more questions. Quiet ones. He asked instructors how they taught students to maintain orientation during turns. Watch the horizon, they said. He asked how a pilot was supposed to do that when the horizon wasn't visible. They dismissed the question. Trust the instruments. Experience solves that. Everyone learns. But Crawford knew experience was not solving it. The graves of young pilots proved that. The Air Force was asking pilots to do something impossible, maintain visual orientation using a reference that disappeared at the most critical moment, and no amount of discipline could fix that. One afternoon, Crawford stood beside a runway as an aircraft performed a training circuit. The pilot initiated a tight left turn, descending slightly. For a fraction of a second, the aircraft wobbled. Crawford's heart tightened. The pilot recovered, but just barely. That moment confirmed everything. The problem was not ignorance. It was not courage. It was not intelligence. It was design, but not the kind of design engineers were looking for. The aircraft flew perfectly according to physics. The failure occurred at the interface between machine and human perception. Crawford realized something that frightened him. If he was right, then the solution did not require new engines, new wings, or new aircraft. It required changing how pilots perceived the aircraft's attitude, and that meant challenging deeply held assumptions. In military culture, complexity equaled competence. Simple ideas were suspicious. If the problem was killing thousands, the solution was expected to be equally grand. Crawford's emerging insight was the opposite. The solution might be embarrassingly simple. That simplicity was dangerous, because simple solutions threaten pride. Crawford understood his position. He was young, inexperienced, without authority. If he walked into a briefing room and claimed that hundreds of deaths were caused by something no one had noticed, he would be ignored, or worse, punished for arrogance. So he waited. He continued observing, continued refining his understanding, continued testing his assumptions against reality. Every crash report reinforced his conclusion. The left turn, low altitude, loss of visual reference, disorientation, impact, over and over. The pattern was undeniable. And now, for the first time, Crawford began to think not just about the cause, but about the solution. If pilots lost orientation because they lost sight of the horizon, then perhaps the horizon did not need to be outside the aircraft at all. Perhaps it could be brought inside. The thought seemed almost absurd, and yet, the more he considered it, the more it made sense. Pilots already relied on artificial horizons, complex instruments that required training and interpretation. But in moments of stress, the brain sought simplicity, something immediate, something intuitive. What if there were a way to give the pilot a constant, unmistakable reference? A simple visual cue that told him, instantly, whether the aircraft was level or tilted. Crawford did not yet know how to articulate the idea. He only knew that it existed. Somewhere between his sketches and his observations lay a solution that could stop the deaths. But to suggest it would mean stepping far beyond his role. And that step would change everything.